The committee will come to order. We'll resume consideration of the markup pursuant to notice. I now call up H.R. 1965. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1965, to exempt the smaller public companies from requirements relating to the use of extensible business reporting language.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to encourage the committee to support H.R. 1965, the Small Company Disclosure Simplification Act, today. With citizens in Virginia's 5th Congressional District, my district, and across this nation out of work and underemployed, we must continue to focus on enacting policies that will spur job creation throughout the country. Unfortunately, I continue to hear from my constituents about the impacts of costly regulations on job creation, especially from the small businesses that are disproportionately affected by unnecessary and costly bureaucracy. One such regulation is the Extensible Business Reporting Language, or XBRL, which was mandated by the SEC in 2009. While the SEC's rule is well intended, this requirement has become another example of a regulation where the costs currently outweigh the potential benefits. These small companies often expend tens of thousands of dollars or more on complying with the regulation, yet there is little evidence that investors actually use XBRL, leading one to question its real-world benefits. I have put forth a measured step forward that would offer small companies relief from the burdens of the current XBRL regime. H.R. 1965 provides a voluntary, I'd like to highlight that word, voluntary exemption for emerging growth companies and smaller public companies from the SEC's requirements to file their financial statements via XBRL. It is important to note that nothing in this bill precludes companies from utilizing XBRL for their regulatory filings with the SEC if they wish to do so. The exemption is completely optional and allows smaller companies themselves to assess whether the costs incurred with compliance are outweighed by any potential benefits from utilizing this technology. Indeed, among recent recommendations contained in the SEC's Government Business Forum on Small Business Capital Formation final report was reversing the XBRL requirements for small companies, citing the disproportionate burdens in terms of cost and time. H.R. 1965 provides smaller companies the relief they need while the SEC works to make the XBRL system useful to investors and regulators. I'd also like to highlight that all public companies, again, let me say this, all public companies will continue to have to file quarterly and annual statements with the SEC, and that at most a company would receive an exemption for no more than 5 years. This bill will not kill the implementation of XBRL at the SEC. It is merely providing a voluntary exemption for smaller companies so they can better utilize their capital until the system is ready for prime time. It should also be noted that last Congress, this committee made a strong bipartisan vote of 51 to 55 on identical legislation. For these reasons, I would encourage my colleagues to support this modest regulatory relief for emerging growth and small public companies, the same companies we are depending on to grow our American economy at this critical time. I thank the Chairman for including this bill in this markup today, and I thank the Chairman for the time and yield back.
Gentleman yields back before recognizing another member. Pursuant to markup notice, pre-filed amendments again are given priority recognition. We have 2 pre-filed amendments for the bill currently under consideration. We will consider those before others. Additionally, I wish to remind members, depending upon the pace of the markup and floor action, we expect recorded votes either this evening at 5:30 or tomorrow morning at 10:30. The Chair will attempt to make that final decision, say within a couple of hours, to give members sufficient notice. Before we recognize amendments, is there any discussion on the bill? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
Move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members, this bill would require the SEC within 60 days of enactment to amend its regulations to provide that emerging growth companies and companies with less than $250 million in annual revenues are exempt for up to 5 years from the requirement to use XBRL their SEC filings. Extensible business reporting language, or XBRL, is a computer-readable reporting format that makes it easier to compare companies both against each other and against themselves across time. Since committee consideration of this bill last Congress, the SEC's investor advocate has focused his attention on this issue and has said that the bill would hurt the SEC's ability to modernize disclosure. In fact, the investor advocate estimated that the bill would exclude more than 60% of public companies. The investor advocate also announced a new project by the SEC that would help to reduce costs and improve the current use of XBRL by integrating XBRL tagging directly into HTML formatted documents. I support this effort by the agency as well as increased technological innovation by the industry. In addition, I share the concerns expressed by the Democratic witnesses at the Capital Markets Subcommittee hearing that exempting such a large number of filers from using XBRL would prevent those companies from being easily compared to other companies that use XBRL to the disadvantage of analysts, researchers, and the SEC, investors, and the companies. Since committee consideration in the last Congress, we've also heard from a large array of data transparency advocates who have joined up with both Democrats and Republicans, like Representative Darrell Issa, to advance their concerns about making data accessible and understandable to the general public. As I previously stated today, we must be mindful of the fact that while some of these bills, including this one, seek to reduce burdens and disclosures on companies, they would also affect the quality or availability of information investors need to make investment decisions. Reducing the comparability of 60% of companies among one another and with other non-exempt companies would actually work against capital formation for those companies as investors decide not to invest or demand a higher rate of return on these companies. In light of these concerns and the new efforts by the SEC in this space, I oppose this bill and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes? Gentlelady from Missouri seek recognition. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to speak in support of Mr. Hurt's legislation, H.R. 1965, the Small Company Disclosure Simplification Act, which would help alleviate burdensome data compliance requirements for smaller companies. While the original merits of transparent data in XBRL format are laudable, it ultimately has proven to be too costly than it is worth, particularly for smaller companies. Cumulatively, billions of dollars have been spent on XBRL compliance, resulting from additional personnel, management, and audit committee time, increased liability for misstatements, and extensive reviews required before submitting filings in XBRL format. Yet there has been little evidence of any benefit. Very few analysts, which the data is primarily intended to benefit, even cover smaller reporting companies anyway, and other investors are simply unaware of the data format's existence. Mr. Kovacs, from one of our subcommittee hearings earlier this year, testified regarding that very exact point. In fact, he said many financial analysts who cover the industry, including large institutional investors, don't even know what XBRL is. So here we have companies spending tens of thousands of dollars on compliance, and yet there are many in the industry who either aren't even paying attention or who find it useful. Mr. Hurt's legislation would implement a very reasonable change, one that has been once again recommended by the SEC Government Business Forum on small business capital formation by allowing a temporary and voluntary, and I'd like to stress that this is voluntary, exemption for emerging growth companies and issuers with annual gross revenues under $250 million from XBRL requirements. After all, XBRL filings are not new data, but simply data filed in a different format. Additionally, the SEC would be required to conduct an economic analysis on costs and benefits of XBRL for smaller issuers and report to Congress on the SEC and investors' use of the information. This is necessary, as the SEC's original cost-benefit analysis sampled almost exclusively larger issuers and admitted that it did not actually have accurate data as to the costs this compliance would have on smaller issuers. Ultimately, this legislation will give time for the SEC to fix some of the issues with XBRL data while not footing the bill to smaller companies. In fact, this legislation is so reasonable that similar legislation passed this committee in the last Congress, as Mr. Hurt pointed out, by a vote of 51 to 5. I hope that we can all come together and again pass this legislation in a significant bipartisan manner. I urge passage, and I yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I certainly hope every member was listening carefully to what she had to say here. Again, this particular idea came from the SEC's own Government Business Forum on Small Business Capital Formation. In fact, I think the genesis of almost every bill that we are considering today came from that very same forum. I just wish the SEC would pay a little closer attention to that advice and counsel. Again, this has nothing to do with the factual information that is already mandated for disclosure. Now we're simply talking about format. And we're talking about a format that could cost up to $500,000 that for many in the investing community isn't even used. And so what I recall from our hearings is we had testimony from somebody representing a rather small biotechnology company who asked the people who followed his company, do they use XBRL? And most of them didn't even know what it was. And then we also, I think it was entered into the record, testimony from GM's corporate controller, obviously one of the largest companies in the world, who said, this isn't something we find useful. This isn't something I've heard my financial analysts say is useful. Again, the gentleman from Virginia is providing simply a voluntary exemption. If investors demand that their disclosures be in this format, it would be in the interest of the company to do that. It is not in the interest of our economy. It is not in the interest of the unemployed and underemployed to put perhaps an extra $500,000 burden on emergent growth companies that could better be used for research and development so that they can put America back to work. So I thank the gentleman from Virginia and I thank the gentlelady from Missouri for yielding time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. I move to strike the last word. Thank the chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. And I want to thank Mr. Hurt for his hard work on and devotion on this issue. But this bill continues to concern me. I believe that supporting XBRL is supporting the future competitiveness of our country. It allows our countries to compete and win in an increasingly competitive environment and grow technology companies that people may not know about unless they can access the information quickly. I do want to place in the record the only study I was able to find on the cost, and it was done by the U.S. CPAs. They came together and did an analysis of it, the Institute of CPAs, and they said the average cost of compliance would be $8,000. I want to state that other countries are far ahead of us. They've gone to XBRL and have been started putting their companies in it and helping their investors. And I would say it helps the companies too, because when someone can look easily at information quickly and see that you've got an idea or you're performing well, they're going to invest in you. But if they have to go through papers and papers and read, time-consuming, companies' 100-page financial filings, they may do it for large companies. They're not going to do it for small companies. So I say, because it's too time-consuming for analysts, investors to go through small companies' filings. But this program will quickly download standardized financial statements for an entire industry and directly to spreadsheets that would start cross-company comparisons in order to identify the best performers. If the best performers are identified quickly, then capital is going to flow to them, and they're going to be able to expand, hire more people, advance new technologies. And what has grown this country in the past? Everything that has lifted us out of any financial disaster has always been the American innovation, the new idea. This allows us to identify those new ideas quickly and cheaply. It enables investors to easily identify what I would call companies in the rough, small ones that people have never heard about, that are in somebody's basement, like Apple and Dell and some of these other big companies were, that have innovative business models but have trouble attracting attention because they're small and they're new. This is a way to attract attention of analysts and institutional investors very quickly, and I would say cheaply. I'd say $8,000 to be able to download and compare the work of your company is a good deal. A small company's filings may tell a fantastic story about why that company is poised to be the next Apple or the next Google. But if the search costs are high, if it's going to take a lot of time for an analyst or an investor to wade through all this papers and everything, they're not going to do it. And the economy will never realize the benefits that that company has to offer. And that company will not be able to have those benefits. They'll never have the capital infusion that they need, which they can get in this competitive process. And this is where XBRL comes in. It dramatically reduces the search costs by making it fast and cheap for investors to gather standardized financial statements for entire industries, including small companies that the investor wouldn't have bothered with before. And if these smaller companies offer greater value than the bigger ones or more established companies in the industry, then it will likely be obvious to the investor looking at this data. This will result in capital flowing more efficiently, not just to the biggest, most well-known companies, but to companies that can use that capital in the most efficient way. And this allows investors to spend more time analyzing data and less time gathering data. And I'd like to quote the Chamber of Commerce and put their letter in the record, and I quote, "Digital disclosures are the way of the future, and XBRL is the first step down that road," end quote. So if you want to improve small companies' access to capital, rolling back XBRL is the last thing you want to do. I believe we should be moving forward, not backward, with XBRL, and I think it is a big and important investment in the economic growth of our country. We're already behind the rest of the developed world, and I believe we should think very hard about this issue before we take away a tool that benefits both investors, small companies, and I'd say the growth of our economy. This bill would exempt roughly 60% of all public companies from the requirement of XBRL. I believe it's the wrong way to go. I believe strongly in XBRL, and I'm working with former Chairman Issa on a bill to strengthen it and expand it. I think this bill would put us backwards into the 20th century. I urge everyone to oppose it, even though I respect deeply the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Virginia and his hard work.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
So, thanks, the Chair.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. So, I agree with the gentlelady from New York that what we should be about is the same thing that industry should be about, and that is the availability and enhancement of the availability of capital for them. I guess the question is whether we should supplant our decision for getting there over theirs, or whether they are in a better position to make that decision for themselves. The admirable part of this bill is the fact, that's been pointed out 1, 2, 3 times already, is the fact that it is voluntary. So if the position that the gentlelady has set out is accurate, and if the position of the XBRL is accurate, that this is plays a bonanza, if you will, for capital formation for these small up and growing companies, then they have, according to the sponsor, the ability to make that selection on their own. So I would disagree, for example, with the language in the letter dated May 19th from XBRL US, when it says, "Management of public companies is acutely aware of the costs associated with a given regulation, and they may not recognize the immediate benefits of regulations." Well, yeah, I think they do. I think they are actually closer to the situation than we are, and I think that was exactly the line of discussion that we had 2 bills ago, when we had a current member who was in his former capacity as a business owner and manager, was able to see the front lines in a management position what actually was best in the decision-making process. So this bill basically gives the company that voluntary basis to do it. And again, I also concur with the chairman and Ms. Wagner when they pointed out that testimony, that was takeaway testimony. And the quote that I had from that meeting was, the consensus response I got was, they didn't even know what XBRL was. So if it's such a great program, how come people don't know who it is? Now, maybe you would say, well, that was just one of our panelists saying that, so let's dig a little deeper. And the other facts we know is that a report from Columbia University shows that less than 10% of investors have used XBRL data. So I guess whether you're talking anecdotally from a panelist or from an actual study by a named university, in both cases they sort of confound the argument of XBRL. Actually, XBRL's argument is confounded not only by outside sources, but it's confounded by their own statements. If you read their letter of May 19th, they say they understand that a potential amendment to this bill, which would provide exemptions just for smaller companies, would do so because they understand that going public is very expensive and a complex course of action, and once these companies are no longer defined as EGCs, XBRL requirements should be back in force. So what does that mean? They in themselves recognize that doing this is burdensome to a certain line of companies. And finally, I would just beg to differ with the gentlelady's comment and interpretation of what the Chamber's position on it. I believe they have said that 1965 bill would, Small Company Disclosure Simplification Act would, as I said, provide a temporary and optional exemption for small companies, and to do so, exemption for EGCs and small would allow boards and their shareholders the authority to decide whether if using XBRL is in their best interest. So I close where I began. They too agree with what we are all saying here. Allowing this voluntary decisions puts those in the management positions, the best position to decide how and when and why they would be able to make those decisions to get capital formation or reduce their regulatory burdens. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on general discussion before we go to, for what purpose the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I originally voted for H.R. 1965, and after looking at this issue, I've changed my mind. The reason why is because, first of all, the SEC has taken some steps forward in recent years. In 2009, the Commission began to require companies to provide their financial statements using XBRL. XBRL is a global standard for structured financial reporting. The SEC began compiling structured data sets and posting them for use by investors and academics, and the Commission is working to develop an inline XBRL to integrate XBRL tagging directly into HTML formatted documents. So that should simplify things. The SEC also moved to demand a higher quality of data. The SEC sent out letters to filers urging them to correct errors. This progress would be thwarted by the bill. In November, SEC Chair White told the Financial Services Committee that this proposed exemption would harm investors' interests because it would restrict investors and the SEC's ability to, quote, search and analyze the financial information dynamically and compare financial and business performance across companies, reporting periods, and agencies. Also, Rick Fleming, the investor advocate at the SEC, made a speech in February where he warned, quote, if passed by the Senate and signed into law, I believe this bill would seriously impede the ability of the SEC to bring disclosure into the 21st century, unquote. And I ask unanimous consent to enter Mr. Fleming's remarks into the record.
Without objection.
So third, the American Institute for CPAs, and I believe this report's been referenced already, released a study showing the cost of filing are affordable, contrary to what some testimony we've had, for a publicly traded company. So the American Institute of CPAs found the true average cost to small companies is just over about $10,000, with the median cost being about $8,000. And so firms that enjoy the privilege of listing on public securities exchange in the strongest market in the world should find that affordable. The two firms who testified about much higher costs I believe were outliers. And maybe they had higher priced employees, or including many years of their costs, aggregated way, or maybe their costs were not indicative. But at the end of the day, I think this is in the best interest of our economy. Why should investors need to dig through piles of paper files when we can use online electronic searchable databases? That's what the SEC's XBRL provides. Structured and layered data enables investors, academics, regulators, and the public to use tabs and hyperlinks to quickly find the information that is most important to them. Pension plans and other large investment firms can easily compare firms to each other or track areas broadly. So I don't support the bill, although I did it one time, and I do have some amendments I'd like to bring forward, which I hope will improve the bill a little bit. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wish to be recognized on the bill. If not, the gentleman from Minnesota is now recognized. For what purpose?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause for a moment and allow the amendment to be distributed. And I'm sorry, since the gentleman has two amendments, which one?
The first one would be,
How is it styled?
the document I have, all right, it's styled,
Is it 048?
yes, 048.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any member who has not received a copy of the amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Ellison, redesignate Section 4 and 5 as Sections 5 and 6.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment provides an incentive for the SEC to move quickly to implement inline XBRL. The amendment ends all exemptions when inline XBRL becomes operational. Currently, the SEC collects every financial statement twice, once as a document and again as XBRL data. If the SEC adopted the inline XBRL format, iXBRL, which is both human readable and machine readable, and required a single filing in iXBRL rather than a document version and an XBRL version, companies would no longer be required to carefully compare the two versions before filing. This comparison could drive unnecessary costs. In addition, with a single version rather than two, the SEC's existing review process, which today focuses on document version and ignores the data versions, would improve data quality even without reforms. And that's because reviewers would only have one version, the data version, to look at. So poor quality data is one reason for investors' current concerns, and it could be animating Mr. Hurt's bill of XBRL data. And for the XBRL perceived issues to reduce capital costs for smaller companies through market efficiency. According to Chair Mary Jo White's responses to questions, for the record, from me after the April 29, 2014 hearing, SEC staff have prepared a proposal to adopt inline XBRL, but the SEC has not acted on it. The move from dual submission XBRL plus documents to a single submission inline XBRL has been in the works for years already. And the SEC's delay is the reason why the whole program is up in the air. So my amendment would provide an incentive for SEC to move forward quickly to implement inline XBRL, which I think would be a great benefit. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? Gentleman for Virginia seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I would, first of all, thank the gentleman for his comments and for his offer of amendments. There are probably a couple of things that I can say that we all agree on. First is that the ultimate goal of the SEC in implementing the final inline XBRL product is worthy. I think that the problem, however, is that since this rule was originally promulgated in 2009, everybody's still waiting, and everybody is still paying. And the problem is that because of the inaction by the SEC, I believe that these companies are being disproportionately punished, and so that's the purpose of this bill, is to do this, and that is to make it a voluntary, optional exemption for those companies that are described within the exemption. This does a couple of things. Number one, it gives certainty to the companies that they know that they're not on the hook for this. Something, by the way, as studies have been bandied about, Columbia University, and I think the chairman mentioned this, the Columbia University studied this and found that only 10% of investors use this. This is not something where there is evidence that investors find this useful at all. But the bottom line is if the companies find that it's useful, then they can continue to do it. If the company's investors find it's useful, they can continue to do it. This would simply be a voluntary optional relief until XBRL is, the next generation of XBRL is ready for prime time, and it is not. So I would ask that the committee reject this amendment and adopt the measure as is. I yield back.
The gentleman yield to the chair. Would the gentleman yield to the chair?
Gentleman yields.
Yes, I wish to applaud what the gentleman says and concur. I would urge all members to reject this amendment. I yield back to the gentleman. The gentleman yields back his time. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota. Okay. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. The gentleman from Minnesota is now recognized for his second amendment. We will pause for a moment and allow the amendment to be distributed. Has every member received a copy of the amendment? If so, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Ellison, page 2, beginning on line 2, strike "and other smaller companies."
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you again for the time, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the ranking member as well. So this amendment limits the exemption to emerging growth companies only. The current bill exempts emerging growth companies from XBRL reporting permanently for as long as they continue to be emerging growth companies, and then also exempts other companies below $250 million in revenue for 3 to 5 years, depending upon the results of a study and an SEC action. This is too much of the market. Estimates are that about 2/3 of publicly traded companies could be exempt. This amendment, my amendment, would limit XBRL exemption to emerging growth companies. It would then apply the same 3 to 5 year time frame to the emerging growth company exemption, so that the emerging growth company exemption would not be permanent. I just want to add that if the concerns that my colleague, Mr. Hurt, raises are legitimate, certainly what they need is an on-ramp, not just a permanent exemption. So I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? The gentleman from Virginia seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I would point out that in response to the gentleman's last comment, that nothing about any of this is permanent. The bottom line is this is temporary relief offered to help small emerging growth companies, smaller companies with revenues under $250 million, smaller issuers, to help them deal with the costs of unnecessary regulation. This is regulation that is not helping their bottom line. It's not helping them create better products. It's not helping them find investors. And that is the purpose of this bill, and this, of course, limits that. It seems to me that if this is good for emerging growth companies, then it should absolutely be good for smaller issuers who are also having to suffer under a regime that is useless by a lot of the evidence that we've heard. Now, that's, again, not to say that we don't want to get to an XBRL system that works and that is actually useful to investors, but the overwhelming evidence has been that the investors don't use this and are not going to use it until it is actually useful. If you look back and think about what the mission of the SEC is, it is to protect investors. And I was interested to hear the quote from the investor advocate. If you're trying to protect investors, if that's part of your mission, it seems like to me you would care what investors think and what the information that they use, and the evidence before this committee has been that they don't use it. And there have been some suggestions that in the way the the way the data is presented, that there are times when it is actually inaccurate, when it distorts facts when they try to put it into this language. If you want efficient markets, if you want capital formation, I don't see how you're going to have either of those things if you have these additional costs, you have these inaccuracies and distortions, and I think that only serves as a barrier to efficient markets and is a deterrent to capital formation. So again, for the same reasons earlier stated, I would ask that this committee reject the amendment. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentlelady.
I agree that this amendment should be rejected with due respect. Some of these percentages that are presented, I think, are extremely and grossly misleading, and I believe the wrong lens by which to view this issue. For example, although companies with less than $2 billion market cap make up for over 80% of all listed companies, they represent only 6.6% of total market value. A small public company is not inherently equal to the largest public companies. It is important to note that just because we have a great number of smaller companies does not mean they should have to endure disproportionate burdens. I yield back to the gentleman.
I yield.
Would the gentleman yield to the chair?
Yield to the chair.
Again, I think it bears emphasis one more time that this is voluntary. Nobody is prohibiting these smaller companies from using XBRL. I'm sorry the gentlelady from New York is no longer in the hearing room, but she went on at great length about how advantageous it is for these smaller companies to use XBRL, and should she be correct, they lawfully can do so. And my guess is, if it is in their self-interest, they'll figure out what their self-interest is. Yet this committee has been presented with a great amount of testimony saying for a lot of these smaller companies, it is not to their advantage, so why don't we give them the choice? And I hope that we would, and I wanted to concur and urge members to reject the amendment from the gentleman from Minnesota. I thank the gentleman from Virginia who yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members, I support this amendment. This amendment seeks to narrow an overly broad bill, which would exempt more than 60% of public companies from filing their public reports with the SEC in XBRL format. Specifically, the bill's exemption would only apply to emerging growth companies, or EGCs, a category of newly public companies created by the Jobs Act with less than $1 billion in revenues, $700 million in public float, and $1 billion in non-convertible debt, which are exempt for up to 5 years from a variety of securities law requirements. Providing an exemption only for EGCs rather than also for small companies with less than $250 million in annual revenue would be more consistent with Congress's objective in the Jobs Act to provide certain time-limited disclosure relief to a narrow subset of public companies by significantly narrowing the universe of companies that would not have to file their reports in XBRL format. This amendment would modestly improve a bill that the SEC's investor advocate recently stated would seriously impede the ability of the SEC to bring disclosure into the 21st century. However, in light of the recent efforts by the SEC to create a more cost-efficient solution known as the inline XBRL project, I'm concerned that this amendment does not go far enough and would still impede the comparability of companies to EGCs and in turn impede their ability to raise capital. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Are there any further debate on the amendment? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted.
As for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, recorded votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motion to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 1975. The clerk will report the bill, which has been distributed in advance.
H.R. 1975, to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to require that the Securities Exchange
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we have here is a bill that I just simply think is the right thing to do. You know, generally when people or organizations pay their bills or their taxes, they generally know that they will get a refund or a credit in their account if they overpay. However, this is not the case if you overpay the SEC. When the national security associations like FINRA overpay their fees to the SEC, they cannot get a refund or credit for future use. That is because of the way that the SEC appropriation currently works, as it receives its appropriated funds through advances from the U.S. Treasury and in advance of the collection of the fees, which then go to the U.S. Treasury. Under Section 31 of the Exchange Act, each national securities association, such as FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and all of the national securities exchanges, must pay the Commission twice annually a fee based on the aggregate dollar amount of transactions related to certain sales of securities. These fees are designed to recover the costs incurred by the government, including the SEC, for supervising and regulating the securities markets and securities professionals. The fee rate may change annually as part of the Commission's budget appropriation by Congress for a particular fiscal year. The exchanges sometimes make mistakes and overpay the fees to the SEC. It could be because of staff error in the calculations or caused by some system failures. The SEC staff has estimated that over the past 10 years, the exchanges of FINRA and FINRA have overpaid at a total of about $6 million. So what this bill simply does is try to set up the process so that if there is a overpayment, it would allow the SEC to refund or credit the national security exchanges and the national securities associations. And it sets up that mechanism so that that would happen. So this bill will address, and then the SEC has tried to figure out how to do that. They cannot do that under the way they are funded now. So this bill would address that issue, and the SEC requested this similar kind of authority in their fiscal 2014 authorization request. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to speak in support of H.R. 1975, the Securities and Exchange Commission Overpayment Act. H.R. 1975 would allow the SEC to effect refunds by allowing SROs to offset previous Section 31 overpayments against future Section 31 overpayments under a 10-year statute of limitations. In 2008, the Chicago Stock Exchange discovered more than $150,000 in overpayments for 2007 Section 31 fees after transitioning to a new electronic trading model. Similarly, in 2014, NASDAQ discovered around $750,000 in Section 31 fee overpayments from 2013. These exchanges overpaid out of an abundance of caution rather than risk an enforcement action for underpayment. The SEC has not refunded these overpayments because they believe they lack statutory authorization to do so. H.R. 1975 would provide that statutory authority. SEC Chairwoman Mary Jo White, in a 2013 letter to this committee, recommended that the Commission be permitted to effect refunds by allowing an SRO to offset previous Section 31 overpayments against future Section 31 payments. This would clarify the Commission has the authority to follow this approach to effect such refunds, end quote, from Secretary or SEC Chairwoman Mary Jo White. H.R. 1975 is a simple legislative fix with support among securities exchanges and the SEC itself. I want to thank my colleague and friend, Congressman Gregory Meeks, for his work on this bill and those who have co-sponsored it. And with that, I yield back the balance. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, there being no further discussion. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have an amendment.
Gentleman has an amendment. We will pause for a moment and allow it to be distributed. Is there any member who has not received a copy of the amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Meeks. At the end of the bill, insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank Mr. Hallgreen for his work and working collectively to put this bill together. This is a very simple and small amendment. As we know, the SEC has a very tight budget, and this bill is in no way an attempt to deprive the SEC of resources. And so to make sure that is clear, that is absolutely clear, what we are proposing in this amendment is to clarify that the funds for any such refunds would have to be appropriated and not be deducted from the existing SEC resources. So this amendment just makes that absolutely clear. We're not trying to take any money from the SEC, and it gives the SEC, who had explored ways of reimbursing overpayments themselves, and there was no statutory mechanism that allowed the SEC to refund payments that is not aware of doing a given year. This does it, but does not take money out of their existing resources. So I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes to urge rejection of the amendment. I believe the SEC has had their budget doubled since the year 2000. They've had substantial increases over many other government agencies. We will always listen very carefully to the SEC's viewpoint, and one of the viewpoints I have listened to when this underlying bill was requested by the SEC. They did not request the amendment or an appropriation, as the gentleman from New York is offering. And so I do not believe it is necessary. I do not believe it is helpful. And I would urge rejection of the gentleman's amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The amendment is
Roll call vote.
adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Are there any further amendments? If not, there being no further amendments, recorded votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motion to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 2064. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2064 to amend certain provisions of the securities laws relating to the treatment of emerging growth.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was pleased to introduce H.R. 2064, the Improving Access to Capital for Emerging Growth Companies Act, with Congressman John Delaney of Maryland, whose personal experience with our capital markets makes him uniquely suited to work on these issues and find ways to improve our current system. This legislation builds upon the success of the original Bipartisan Jobs Act that I worked on, which created a new category of stock offering for emerging growth companies, which have proven to be a major new source of job creation for the 21st century. A 2014 study by Ernst & Young showed that smaller companies continue to dominate the IPO market, specifically that approximately 81% of all publicly filed IPO registration statements and approximately 84% of the IPOs that went effective since April 2012 were filed by emerging growth companies. Job creation is the most important reason to pass this legislation quickly. More companies going public leads to more expansion and investment, which will lead to job creation and a brighter, more productive economy. Our bill makes some important changes to the registration process to ensure that these companies have the most efficient, streamlined access to the market. Shortening the 21-day filing period to 15 days would save companies exposure to some market volatility before a public launch. The purpose of the 21-day period is to allow the information about the EGC IPO to disseminate to the public before purchase orders are taken on the EGC stock. But with today's technology, the current 21-day quiet period is unnecessarily long. The shortened time period would allow the benefit of clear visibility in market conditions and would save companies having to update financials and other disclosures before public launch. Additionally, the bill calls for a grace period of Jobs Act protections to an issuer who loses EGC status mid-IPO process. Under current law, if a company exceeds the EGC status criteria during the IPO process, it no longer qualifies for the designation. This discourages a borderline EGC that may be considering going public from making an offering. This grace period would allow an issuer who qualifies as an EGC at the time of filing of its confidential registration statement for review to continue to be treated as an EGC through the date on which it completes its initial public offering of 1 year has passed, or whichever comes first. Finally, the bill would permit EGCs to avoid incurring significant expense and effort of preparing and having audited financials and related disclosures for past periods that will not be included in the prospectus to investors. Identical legislation passed this committee 56-0 last Congress, so I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support H.R. 2064. This is a simple common sense adjustment to reduce the burdens placed on smaller companies that are trying to access the market, grow their businesses, and hire more employees. Now more than ever, we as members of Congress need to be sharply focused on the ways to facilitate job creation, and this bill is an important step in this direction. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your willingness to allow us to do this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Fincher, for giving me the opportunity to work with him on this bill and for his leadership in this area. And I think he summarized the bill beautifully, so there's not a lot of details I can add to how the bill works, but I do want to make two observations.
The first is, if you think about the profile of emerging growth companies, they need liquidity or a liquidity event at some point in the future based on the type of investors they have and sponsors they have. And there's really two ways for them to have that liquidity event. They could either sell the company or they can take it public. And we as a Congress, should have a view as to what we'd like them to do, even though in a free country they can do whatever they want. But we certainly want to level the playing field for the public offering route, because the data clearly suggests, and Congressman Fincher mentioned this, that when companies go public, they're much more likely to use the capital they raise to grow their business and expand their employee base, as opposed to companies that get sold, which may still grow their business, but oftentimes the premise of the sale is efficiencies and cost savings and things like that, that create a profile where a company that is sold, even if it continues to grow within a larger business, doesn't add as many employees. So making sure we're creating a situation where companies feel comfortable going public, I think, is a good thing, because I think that will lead to more job creation, which is something that we all care about. And we've clearly seen over the last decade a decline in the number of companies going public. So there's clearly something going on with respect to the regulatory burden associated with a public offering that this is smart, common sense legislation designed to address. The other thing that we need to remember is that when a company goes public, it is the time of most scrutiny on that company's financial statements and business practices. Because not only does an investment bank have to take the company public and do a lot of due diligence around the company and its business practice and its financials, but the SEC reviews all their filings, which isn't true of every public company, but they review all the filings of an initial public offering. And investors, mostly institutional investors, spend a lot of time with the company on road shows and doing their own diligence. So the time of the IPO is the time of greatest scrutiny. Investment banks, investors, and the SEC are all thoroughly involved in scrubbing the company. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for some smart relief that allows for an easier on-ramp for these companies to go public, and I do think this bill does that. So I think it's good public policy to level the playing field. It will result in more companies going public. That will help create jobs. And I don't think there should be much concern that there's not a thorough vetting of these companies, because in fact companies that go public are scrutinized much more closely than companies are on an ongoing basis, where the SEC may not be reviewing all their financials and there's no underwriter of their securities. People can just buy and sell it in the market. So I think this is a very good bill. I urge my colleagues to support it. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Fincher, for letting me work with him on this bill, and I want to thank the Chairman for bringing it up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Remind all members, pursuant to notice, pre-filed amendments will be given priority recognition. We have one pre-filed amendment for this bill under consideration. Before turning to that, is there further discussion of the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to thank Mr. Delaney and Mr. Fincher for this work. As somebody who spent a lot of my career working in this market, I think it makes eminent sense to make these changes, particularly in the concept of the audit issue on IPOs. That's very time sensitive and can end up causing a 3 or 4 month delay when you're trying to get that next extended year audited, and when it's not even going to be in the prospectus. So I want to echo my support, appreciate Mr. Fincher's leadership, and yield the balance of my time to Mr. Fincher should he need it.
I thank the gentleman from Arkansas. Again, this is, and it's a privilege to work with Mr. Delaney on these common sense fixes that allow more jobs to be created all over this country. That's what this is about. If America is going to grow and we're going to be what we once was, it's all about growth and job creation. So I appreciate that. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from Arkansas.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the underlying bill? If not, for what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause while the amendment is distributed. Is there any member who has not received the amendment? If not, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Fincher for himself and Mr. Delaney on page 2, line
Without
26.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a technical amendment offered by myself and Mr. Delaney of Maryland to include Form F1 filers in Section 4 of the bill that affects those registering with the Form S1. This provision would assist these companies in reducing the expense of preparing audited financial statements by ensuring that they are not required to provide statements that ultimately will be included in the information given to investors. A recent study showed that since the enactment of the Jobs Act, the number of foreign private issuer registrant filings as emerging growth companies has increased each year. Foreign private issuers represented 19% of all EGC IPO registration statements in the first half of 2014. It was not the intent of the bill to exclude Form F1, and in keeping with the spirit of the Jobs Act, the provision in our bill should apply to both Forms S1 and F1. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption and reporting the bill as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I call for a roll call vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2354. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2354, to direct the Securities and Exchange Commission to review all its significant...
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to ask our colleagues on the committee today to support H.R. 2354, the Streamlining Excessive and Costly Regulations Review Act. This bill that I've introduced along with our colleague Representative Sinema would direct the SEC to retrospectively review its regulations with the goal of ensuring that they are effective and up to date. This bill will enable the SEC to operate in the most effective manner possible, and it would afford the SEC with the autonomy and flexibility to make this mandate effective. The President endorsed this idea in a 2011 executive order, and in response, the SEC requested public comment. Since that time, however, the SEC has failed to take meaningful or affirmative action in response to the executive order. Instead, the SEC needs a process to review, eliminate, and amend old rules. I believe this bill is imperative to creating a responsible and efficient regulatory environment that supports the SEC's mission to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. This bill is structured in a manner similar to the 1996 Paperwork Reduction Act process that prudential regulators conduct, and it adheres to the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. In addition, this bill allows the SEC the flexibility to structure a review that works for the Commission while providing Congress with the insight it needs to hold the Commission accountable. The end goal is simple: to have the SEC streamline, modernize, and periodically review its regulations so that they are effective and up to date. I believe this common sense approach is measured and appropriate for the SEC. Mr. Chairman, I thank Representative Sinema for her contributions to this bipartisan measure, and I hope the committee will support this legislation. I also want to thank the Chairman again for including this measure in this markup this afternoon, and I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Congressman Hurt. Business owners in Arizona regularly tell me that our inefficient and often confusing regulatory environment hurts their ability to grow and hire. This common sense legislation requires the SEC to improve and repeal outdated regulations holding them accountable and providing certainty for businesses and consumers in Arizona. The bill requires the SEC to, within 5 years of enactment, and then once every 10 years thereafter, review all significant SEC rules and determine by commission vote whether they are, first, outmoded, ineffective, insufficient, or excessively burdensome, or second, are no longer in the public interest or consistent with the SEC's mission to protect investors, facilitate capital formation, and maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets. The Commission would then be required to provide notice and solicit public comment on whether such rules should be amended or repealed, and then amend or repeal any such rule by vote in accordance with the Administrative Procedures Act. Finally, the Commission would report to Congress within 45 days after any final vote, including any suggestions for legislative changes. The EGRPRA requires federal banking agencies to review all regulations every 10 years to identify whether they are outdated or unnecessary. This bill would require the SEC to review only major or significant rules, a significantly lesser burden. The bill would not allow mandatory rulemakings to be repealed unilaterally by the SEC. Should the SEC determine that legislation is necessary to amend or repeal any regulation, it requires the Commission to include in their report to Congress recommendations for such legislation. Finally, with the adoption of the Manager's Amendment that will soon be offered by my colleague, Congressman Hurt, the bill would prevent additional litigation by clarifying that the initial SEC vote would not be subject to judicial review. I believe reviewing significant rules of the SEC, as directed by the Administration's 2011 executive order, is a worthwhile use of SEC resources, and I hope my colleagues will join me in support of this important bipartisan legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? Gentleman from Maine seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am, frankly, Mr. Chairman, a little bit disappointed in the first part of the hearing today. We've been here for over 5 hours, and there was a considerable amount of time that was spent today by folks on the other side of the aisle using this as a platform to discuss issues that were not supposed to be discussed today. And I hope that going down the path, I encourage our fellow members of Congress and of this committee on the other side of the aisle to please focus on what we're trying to get done here today instead of being distracted by other issues that are outside of this, this meeting. To that extent, we have 13 terrific bills here, Mr. Chairman, today. And if we can get right to the work of the people, we can get this work done and help our families have better lives by helping to our economy grow. And I want to salute Congresswoman Sinema from Arizona and Congressman Robert Hurd from Virginia for the great work they've done on H.R. 2354. This is a common sense thing that businesses do all the time. At least they do in Maine, 2nd District that I represent. You know, if you travel our district, you'll find that there are tens of thousands of small business owners throughout our state, in our district, and there always seems like they're battling the government, Mr. Chairman, to find a better way to grow their business, hire more people, and be more successful. Energy costs are too high, health care costs are too high, taxes are too high, but the most important thing that they tell me is that the regulatory environment is absolutely smothering their business. They are spending more and more time, Mr. Chairman, dealing with government compliance than they are growing their business and hiring more people. So when I look at some of the OMB numbers that say that Americans spend about $1.7 trillion every year to pay for regulations, that equates to about $15,000 per household, Mr. Chairman, that our families are spending just on the regulatory environment, that we need to do something. So I want to salute Congresswoman Sinema. I want to salute Congressman Hurd for submitting this bill. It's common sense that the SEC follow the same regulations or the same process, if you will, as some of our other regulators like the FDIC, the Control of the Currency, and the Federal Reserve, where they have to dust off regulations that they have had for the past 10 years and take a good look at them and see if they're working anymore. If they're burdensome, they're unnecessary, they're too costly, and they're causing a problem with our economy and our job creators, then they ought to be repealed. And that's exactly what this bill does, and there are 12 other bills that we're working on today that I hope we get to all of them, that expand ownership, company ownership for employees and access to capital, as well as reducing the regulatory environment. So I do want to salute my colleagues for this bill, and I want to encourage everybody, please, on this committee, both sides of the aisle, stay focused on the work at hand, do the people's business, and get right to this, because this is a terrific bill. And again, I want to salute my colleagues for getting there. Now, I might add this, Mr. Chairman, where this is so relevant to our families across the country is I know these bills that we're working on today deal in the financial services space. But let's say you are a teller at a credit rating agency in Lewiston, and maybe your husband is working in an automotive repair shop in Bangor, and you're putting $100 a month aside to prepare for and plan for your retirement. And maybe you're putting another $100 a month aside for your kids' education. Well, you're in the business of the banking business, or in the business of repairing automobiles. You're not in the investment business. Well, what this regulation does is make sure that those firms that will work for those individuals to prepare for their retirement, help them grow their nest egg so they can retire with dignity and plenty of money to live on, or send their kids to college, are not burdened with regulations that drive up the cost of their services, drive down the rates of return, such that there is less money to retire with, less money for these kids to go to school. So I'm all for this. Again, I congratulate Mr. Hurd and Congresswoman Sinema for the great work in this bill, and I encourage everybody to support it. I yield my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members, I support regular review of regulations to ensure that they are still relevant to our ever-changing economy. And I support the stated intent of this bill, which is to replicate a framework like the decennial review bank. Regulators' conduct of their rules under the Economic Growth and Regulatory Paperwork Reduction Act of 1996. Unfortunately, despite the best intentions, this bill places an additional administrative burden on the Securities and Exchange Commission, an already overburdened and underfunded regulator. Specifically, it requires the Commission to conduct additional retrospective rule review within 5 years of the bill's enactment, and then once every 10 years thereafter. Today, the SEC has a number of formal and informal processes for identifying existing rules for review. For example, the Regulatory Flexibility Act already requires the SEC to conduct a 10-year retrospective rule review, and the Paperwork Reduction Act requires periodic reviews of information collection burdens. The SEC is also currently conducting several broad-based reviews of rules related to issuer disclosure, equity market structure, and the definition of accredited investor. The bill also makes several important deviations from the comparable bank rule. For example, under this bill, the SEC is required to first vote, then provide notice and comment, and then amend or repeal any regulation, possibly supplanting the normal notice and comment process under the Administrative Procedures Act. I'm also concerned under the bill the SEC would be able to amend or replace a congressionally mandated rulemaking simply if it determines that it is ineffective. So even if it is in the public interest to continue the Jobs Act rule permitting general solicitation for 506c private offerings, the SEC could override the will of Congress and repeal the provision. I sure don't want the SEC ignoring what this esteemed body decides. I'm also concerned that the bill exposes the SEC to additional litigation risk, although I understand that there may be a manager's amendment to address this concern. What's more, it appears that the bill would require the SEC to review and amend all of its significant regulations dating from 1934 within the first 5 years of the bill's enactment, which would be extremely resource-intensive and unworkable. Finally, the SEC is already a cash-strapped agency that is attempting to implement the remaining provisions in Dodd-Frank, attempting to implement the Jobs Act, attempting to respond to industry concerns by conducting holistic reviews, holding roundtables, and forming advisory committees on topics ranging from proxy, advisory firms, to equity market structure, to disclosure modernization. I'm opposed to placing yet more burdens on the Commission, especially burdens of the magnitude contemplated under this bill, without providing them with the incremental resources to handle such a new task. So I would oppose this bill, and I would yield back the balance of my time. And well, before I do that, let me just say to Mr. Poliquin, Mr. Bruce Poliquin, one of the friendliest legislators I've ever met, who greets all of the members with a smile, that we did not misuse our time today talking about export-import. And I wanted to make you aware that you have export values of $51 million in your district. And I don't know if you've gotten a chance to meet some of your business people yet, but the New Page Corporation, the Auburn Manufacturing Incorporated, Pack Glen, Trenton Bridge Lobster Pound, Trenton Bridge Lobster Pound Incorporated, and I believe this is Wall Comatrex Incorporated, represent that 51 million in value. So I think it would be wise to not only talk about it, but encourage others to talk about export-import. It is so important to job creation and support of small businesses in your district. And with that warm smile that you have and that lovely attitude that you have, I know your businesses would welcome you to come there and see what they're doing. And so I'm looking to you to help lead the other side of the aisle to support the reauthorization of XM. If anybody could do it, you can do it. Thank you so very much, Mr. Poliquin.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes the gentlelady from Utah seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield my time over to Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Love. I appreciate the additional time. And Ms. Waters, Ranking Member Waters, I greatly appreciate your compliments of my intentions and my attitude when it comes to dealing with members, all members of the United States House of Representatives. And since you have such a great affection for our district, Ms. Waters, I invite you and your husband and your entire family to Maine. We need the business up there. I think I have a very good handle on the businesses in our district, in our state, but I appreciate very much your pointing out what a terrific state we have, and I would agree with you. And again, I welcome you to come up to Maine to experience that hospitality beyond which I can extend to you here in the House of Representatives. Now, given that, Mr. Chair, I would like to set the record straight on a few things that Ranking Member Waters said that were a concern of mine. First of all, in her disinterest in having the SEC abide by the same rule that our other regulators do here in Washington, like the Federal Reserve, to go back retrospectively and look at the rules that they put on the table to make sure that they're not stifling businesses and killing jobs. I make a point out to her that in this bill that's presented by Ms. Sinema and Mr. Hurt, that the SEC does have flexibility in looking at and how they look at these regulations. And I would also comment on Ms. Waters when she said that the SEC, I quote, is a cash-strapped agency. Since 2005, the SEC's budget has increased 64%, from $913 million per year today to $1.5 billion a year to oversee the capital markets and the securities industry. So I would disagree, Mr. Chair, with the ranking member that the SEC is a cash-strapped agency. I would also believe that every regulator in this town should follow the same rules that everybody else does, and I think it would be very healthy for the SEC to look back at regulations that they're imposing on investors and businesses throughout this country to make sure that they are working, and if not, they should repeal them. Thank you. I yield my time.
It's the time of the gentlelady from Utah.
Oh, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Yes, I do.
Gentleman, move to strike the last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I have a bill at the desk, the Ruben Hinojosa Amendment to H.R. 2354, entitled Streamlining Excessive...
Well, the gentleman from Texas then will be recognized to offer an amendment. We will pause for a moment and allow the amendment to be distributed. Has every member received a copy of the amendment, in which case the clerk will report the amendment?
Amendment offered by Mr. Hinojosa.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Texas is recognized to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we consider H.R. 2354, the Streamlining Excessive and Costly Regulation Review Act, I would like to thank Representative Hurt for working on a bipartisan basis and thank Representatives Sinema and Delaney for working to make this a better bill. I think requiring our regulatory agencies to conduct reviews of their regulations every so often and to seek public comment on the review process makes our government much more transparent, accountable, and provides for a better and more effective regulatory environment. Today, I offer a simple amendment to this bill that would authorize appropriations for the review process mandated by this Act. With this bill, we're aiming to ensure that our markets are fair and orderly, but not burdened with unnecessary or outmoded regulations. Let us also ensure that the SEC is not overburdened by giving it the resources it needs to conduct this review process without having to pull resources away from its many other critically important responsibilities. I urge all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment. Authorizing appropriations for the SEC to conduct a review of its regulations will ensure that the review process may be conducted quickly and in the most efficient manner possible, benefiting all stakeholders alike. With that, I yield back.
A gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. In the most friendliest of terms, to my friend from Texas, I urge rejection of his amendment. I know that many of my Democrat friends consider 18 to be the salient number today, 18 days. The 18 that I consider to be most salient is 18 trillion in national debt that is going to be a burden on our children and grandchildren. Can cripple this and make us a bankrupt nation. And so I am just fearful of the language that was used for years and years around here, quote, such sums as necessary, such sums as necessary, when add up to roughly 18 trillion, 159 billion. You get the idea, in national debt, which is unsustainable. I've also heard many of my friends on the other side of the aisle show much concern for the SEC and say they have been cash-strapped and overburdened. I personally am concerned with the cash-strapped and overburdened American worker and American taxpayer, and it is the sheer weight, volume, confusion, and cost of the regulatory burden that is causing our fellow citizens to be cash-strapped and overburdened. I'm having a hard time believing that a government agency, I think perhaps the only financial regulator that right now is exempt from the Agrippa law, I don't understand why it is such a burden for them to comply, and apparently, to some extent, they are voluntarily complying today. Again, as far as being cash-strapped, I'm having a hard time believing. I don't know of any family in my district, perhaps there's some who've had their family budgets doubled in 15 years, but I don't know who they are. I know this agency has had their budget doubled in 15 years. So I'm feeling a little bit more concerned for the cash-strapped and overburdened workers of the 5th District of Texas than I am the SEC. And the number 18 that I consider to be most relevant today is the $18 trillion in national debt, that I'd really like to slow down those spending numbers. Although I much appreciate the work of my friend from Texas in this particular case, I would urge rejection of his amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in support of Mr. Hinojosa's amendment. When I spoke on this base bill, I did say that the SEC is already a cash-strapped agency that is attempting to implement remaining provisions in Dodd-Frank, attempting to implement the Jobs Act, attempting to respond to industry concerns by conducting holistic reviews, holding roundtables, forming advisory committees on topics ranging from proxy advisory firms to equity market structure to disclosure, modernization. And what we have to be careful about is we do not want to take away from their ability to do the enforcement and the examinations that are so important. And so I support this amendment. I think the President requested $1.7 billion for the SEC. I think that they'll end up with about 1.5, and so we do not want to put them in a position where they would not be able to do the work that we expect them to do. They're the cops on the block, and we need them to do the work that they're intended to have done. So I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman for Virginia seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd thank the gentleman for his amendment and his remarks about the underlying bill. I would just say a couple of things about his amendment, with all due respect. I don't believe that it's necessary. I do believe that this review can take place within the context of the current SEC funding. I do think it's also important to remember, for the purposes of this amendment as well as the bill as a whole, that this all sort of began with the President's executive order in 2011, and that executive order wasn't put in place with any kind of language that was contingent on additional funding. I would also point out that in 2015, in recent months, the SEC chair has testified that they're already doing this. So it seems to me that they ought to be able to do this within their existing budget. I would also point out that we have endeavored to structure this bill in a way that gives the SEC flexibility over a period of 5 years to look at major rules, not all rules, not every single thing that's been passed since the 1930s, but major rules as defined that the SEC operates within that definition. Gives them the flexibility to do this. So I don't think that this with all due respect, that this amendment is necessary, and I ask that we defeat it.
Gentleman yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair. The nays appear to have it. The nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Are there any further amendments? For what purposes, gentlemen from Virginia seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, pause for a moment. Allow the amendment to be distributed. Is there any member who has not received a copy of the amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Hurt. At the end of the bill, insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm offering an amendment to H.R. 2354. This simple amendment is a technical addition to the bill that will ensure that any vote that the SEC casts pursuant to subsection A2 of the bill shall be final for the purposes of the SEC review and not subject to judicial review. This amendment addresses concerns of some that there may be some ambiguity in whether the initial review would be considered a final rule. This amendment would in no way limit the due process rights of the regulated entities or other interested parties who may wish to participate in the normal SEC rulemaking process undertaken to implement any rule changes made pursuant to the SEC review. I'm joined by Representative Sinema in asking the committee to support this simple clarifying amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, recorded votes on the pending amendments has been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motion to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 2356. The clerk will report the bill, which has been distributed in advance.
H.R. 2356 to direct the Securities and Exchange
Without objection, the bill is
Commission
considered read and open to amendment at any time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, to sponsor the legislation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having worked in the banking and investment industry for the past 3 decades, I appreciate this committee's efforts to promote capital formation, reduce unnecessary burdens, and grow jobs, and thus our economy. Since I started my latest brokerage firm back in the late 1990s, I've witnessed exchange-traded funds grow from about 100 funds with $100 billion in assets to over 1,300 funds with now over $1.8 trillion in assets. Yet despite their growing popularity and increasing importance to our retail investor base, most broker-dealers do not publish research on ETFs due to anomalies in our securities laws and regulations. In the past, the SEC has implemented safe harbors for research in support of various asset classes: listed equities, corporate debt, closed-end funds. And Congress has also provided explicit safe harbors for research, most recently in Title I of the Jobs Act, for research related to emerging growth companies. However, despite their similarities, ETFs do not benefit from similar safe harbors. And it's been a pleasure to work with my colleague from Delaware, Mr. Carney, who I must also say happy birthday to today, Mr. Chairman, on a bill to address this particular anomaly. And last week he joined me in introducing H.R. 2356, the Fair Access to Investment Research Act. This proposed legislation would direct the SEC to provide a safe harbor for research reports that cover ETFs, so that these reports are not considered offers under Section 5 of the Securities Act of '33. This bill also holds the SEC accountable, something that this Congress certainly feels strongly about, accountable to follow Congress's direction. The bill would propose that the SEC finalize the rule within 120 days, and if that deadline is not met, then an interim safe harbor will take effect until the Commission's rules are finalized. Last week on May 13th, the Capital Markets Subcommittee hearing, there was universal support about increasing investor access and information about ETFs, and that a safe harbor in this regard made sense, and that steps to facilitate this research are long overdue. There was a consensus that the rulemaking function of the SEC has become somewhat dysfunctional. There is no or else if the Commission does not implement rules as directed by the Congress. This bill addresses that dysfunction and would hold the Commission accountable to the following congressional directives. If the Commission does not act within 120 days of the enactment of the bill, a safe harbor would be effective until the Commission finalizes rules. And in my view, that 120-day period gives the SEC plenty of time to do this. Why? Because this is not new ground we're plowing here. The Commission has been asked to do this for the past 17 years. In 1987, the Division of Investment Management declined to respond to Schwab's request for no-action relief, pending a rulemaking in this area that did not come to pass. In 2000, Merrill Lynch approached the staff of the Division of Investment Management regarding no-action relief for research on open-end investment companies. The staff supported the rulemaking, but never took it up. And in 2004, as a part of the Securities Offering Reform Proposal, the SEC requested comment on whether reliance on proposed Rule 139 should be permitted for an issuer if they were an open-end management investment company or other investment company. The comments were universally supportive, but no rule was adopted. This is a common sense proposal that mirrors other research safe harbors that the Commission has granted. With close to 6 million U.S. households holding and using ETFs, investors need access to this research. I thank the Chairman for including this measure. I thank my friend Mr. Carney for joining me in introducing it, and I ask my colleagues to support this bipartisan common sense bill. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? Gentleman from Delaware seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Before the gentleman is recognized, I'm sure he shares my view that there's no better way to spend a birthday than all day at a committee markup, but the committee extends best wishes for his birthday. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 10 years ago, I stopped celebrating birthdays, and I've been trying to hide on my birthday each year since then, but everybody's got these notices that come up on their cell phones and whatnot, and I get more happy birthday wishes today than I've gotten in my life, I think. But I do appreciate the warm regards, and I do appreciate Mr. Hill's, the gentleman from Arkansas's hard work on this piece of legislation, his common sense approach to it, his willingness to hear out issues and concerns that we have, and to continue to work on the bill to improve it kind of as we speak. As Mr. Hill said, this is really pretty simple bill. And it's a common sense bill to address what really is an anomaly in the SEC rules that apply to safe harbors for various securities. ETFs, as Mr. Hill said, are one of the fastest growing investment vehicles in the market. Net assets, as he said, have grown from $102 billion in 2002 to $108 trillion in 2014. The number of ETFs on the market has increased 23% over the same period. But compared to other asset classes, which have this safe harbor protection under sections 137, 138, and 139, ETFs do not have that same safe harbor protection. And that's what our bill attempts to address under Rule 139 for broker-dealers. The reason is that ETFs are a type of investment company that owns a portfolio of assets, much like a mutual fund, but their price fluctuates throughout the day, trading like a stock, as opposed to a mutual fund where the price is set at the end of the day. And the supply of ETF shares can grow or shrink through the process called creation and redemption, whereby authorized persons who are typically large institutional investors like broker-dealers exchange a portfolio of assets to fund for new shares creation, or conversely exchange shares in the fund for the asset's redemption. And as a result, an ETF is known as what's called a continuous distribution, and therefore they are not eligible, if you will, under Rule 139 for this safe harbor protection. The SEC has been looking at expanding a safe harbor for ETF research, particularly as they've grown in popularity, for over 15 years. 15 years. And every time this issue has come up before the SEC, it's received very favorable feedback. We had a hearing just the other day, and I don't know that I've ever seen this before. Every member of the panel agreed that a safe harbor protection ought to apply to ETFs. Mr. Hill mentioned that as well. And that's because it's just common sense. to make more research available to consumers and investors who want to invest in a very popular security. Now, there have been some concerns raised recently. I understand the ranking member has an amendment that she wants, plans to offer. I will be voting for the amendment, but I've discussed some of those issues with Mr. Hill, and I think there are ways that we can work out and come to some agreement around changes to improve the bill and satisfy, hopefully, everybody on both sides of the aisle. I want to thank Mr. Hill again for his expertise. He mentioned at the outset his many years of work in this area and for his leadership on this issue. Again, it's a very simple, common sense bill to address what is an anomaly in the protections for broker-dealers for providing research. I'm tempted to use the 51 seconds left of my time to talk about the Ex-Im Bank, but I think we've covered that in the 5 or 6 hours today, and I certainly don't want to invite a rundown on the Ex-Im projects in my district of Delaware. I just hope that we can come to some resolution of that issue. Again, thank you, Mr. Hill, for your work, and everyone else as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The Chair is happy he doesn't have to take his birthday greeting back. Before recognizing any other member in consultation with the ranking member, with only one more amendment anticipated and one more bill, we're going to make it official, send out the notice. Recorded votes will be taken at 5:30 in roughly 90 minutes. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Utah seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just wanted to speak in support of H.R. 2356. I know it's difficult for us to contemplate that Mr. Hill has been in the banking industry for over 3 decades, seeing how he doesn't look a day over 29. I just wanted to say that he has quite a bit of expertise in this area, and I really appreciate the diligence that the hard work and the diligence to get this bill through. I also wanted to just briefly, since we're talking about anything in this meeting, I just wanted to talk about these bills and how great, how encouraging it is to see some bipartisan work on these bills and helping to make sure that we relieve some of these regulatory burdens on job creators. I also would like to just mention and express my appreciation for the chairman for the respectful, professional decorum in which this meeting was run today. It is incredibly difficult to deal with differences of opinions, and I believe that he has done this body great service by his professionalism. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time to the chair.
The gentlelady has yielded an additional 30 minutes for her. I thank the gentlelady. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Before I make the points that I'd like to make on this bill, I'd like to thank both Mr. Hill and Mr. Carney for the work that they have done working with my staff to try and resolve differences that they may have. Mr. Carney and I talked about it. I understand exactly his concerns and his passion for trying to do something that I think he believes should have been done a long time ago. But with that, let me just say that the exchange-traded funds, or the ETFs, have proliferated in recent years, growing to 1,411 ETFs in 2010, with total net assets of nearly $2 trillion. In an effort to attract more retail investors to these products, this bill seeks to provide a safe harbor for broker-dealers participating in the offering of these products to provide research reports without threat of liability to purchasers. It is my understanding that today several broker-dealers provide ETF research to retail investors, notwithstanding this threat of liability. and it is not clear that any broker-dealers have been sued by investors or been subject to any enforcement action by the SEC or FINRA related to their ETF research reports. In addition, SEC and FINRA staff has raised several concerns with the bill which have not yet been addressed. Specifically, staff has concerns with the bill's broad definition of research reports, which could effectively allow broker-dealers to offer or sell securities to retail investors without being subject to the liability that would normally attach. The lack of clarity about whether important FINRA content regulations would apply to ETF research reports as they apply to other research reports. The permanent ban on requiring any ETF research reports to be filed with FINRA regardless of future abuses. The constraint on the SEC and FINRA's ability to enforce the anti-manipulation and anti-fraud provisions of the securities laws. The fact that the bill may permit brokers to offer ETFs comprised of commodities and derivatives, as well as registered investment companies and BDCs. The broad interim safe harbor that fails to protect investors and goes into effect before the SEC has enough time to finalize its rulemaking, and the short, unworkable 45-day time period for the SEC to propose and 120-day time period for the SEC to finalize a rule. While these concerns remain outstanding, and while it seems that ETF research reports are currently being provided to retail investors without issues, it is difficult for me to support the bill. So I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
To address the strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I hope that the concerns that Mr. Carney has put forward and that the Ranking Member can be worked out, because I think this is a very important bill, and I support it. It requires the SEC to update Rule 139, which provides a safe harbor for broker-dealer research on public companies like Apple, to include research on ETFs and other investment companies. ETFs have grown dramatically over the past 10 years, from roughly $200 billion to over $2 trillion. So it makes sense to get more research out there on this fast-growing sector. The Democratic witness at the Capital Markets Subcommittee hearing on this bill last week, Professor Bullard, said, and I quote, "The SEC should have had a completely different, much less regulated track for ETF research quite some time ago," end quote. Professor Bullard also made a very important point, which is that research on ETFs and other investment companies actually poses fewer risks than research on public companies, because ETFs and investment companies are already subject to strict regulation under the Investment Company Act. So it makes no sense that we would allow broker-dealer research on public companies, but not on ETFs and investment companies to also have safe harbors. I had concerns with the way this bill was initially drafted, which would have created a statutory safe harbor and would have taken away all of the SEC's discretion to write the appropriate rules. But we've been able to work with Mr. Hill and Mr. Carney to come up with a bill that addresses our concerns and is acceptable to me and many others. The revised bill reserves the SEC's discretion to modify their research rules as needed in the future, as soon as the SEC writes the initial rule for ETF research reports. The interim safe harbor in the bill goes away. This will allow the SEC the discretion they need to react to any future issues that may come up in their research rules. The revised bill also adds an important rule of construction, which makes it very clear that this bill in no way weakens any of the anti-fraud or anti-manipulation laws, all of which still apply to ETF research reports. So I'd like to congratulate Mr. Hill, who's worked hard on this bill and has a background in investment banking which will make him an asset to this committee. And I'd also like to thank my colleague and good friend, Mr. Carney, who has put a great deal of time into this bill as well and was critical to getting this deal done. And I thank the ranking member who is working to resolve these concerns. But I urge my colleagues to support this bill and for the authors to work with those who still have remaining questions. And I publicly thank you for working with me in my office and making the changes that we recommended. So I really appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Before we turn to amendments, is there any further discussion? If not, for what purposes the ranking member seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause a moment, allow the amendment to be distributed. Have all members received a copy of the amendment? If so, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a
Unanimous
substitute.
consent to dispense with the reading.
The general, so ordered. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Mr. Chairman and members, this amendment adds several provisions to clarify or tailor the safe harbor from certain liability normally associated with offering documents for broker-dealers to distribute research related to exchange-traded funds and other similar products. As I mentioned earlier, I'm supportive of the sponsor's goal of promoting more research, especially to retail investors in this space, but was concerned that the underlying bill was not sufficiently clear that certain anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authorities were retained. In addition, I'm also concerned that the underlying bill may inadvertently carve out certain content standards currently applicable to other research reports. For example, if a broker-dealer is going to describe the performance of an ETF, it should do so consistent with the standards established by FINRA. FINRA's rules ensure that all communications with the public, including research, are fair and balanced. We do not want to enable broker-dealers to selectively present data, for example, but instead require them to do so in a standardized process. While it may seem fairly straightforward that broker-dealers should be able to issue research on ETFs just as they do for individual companies, the current regulatory structure in place, which is intended to prevent fraud and manipulation, requires a carefully crafted exemption. We received very extensive comments from the staffs of FINRA and SEC, as well as the witnesses at the hearing, and I felt it important to address their concerns. This cautious approach is complicated by the fact that it is also trying to force the SEC to act. It does so by threatening a statutory safe harbor after 120 days if the SEC doesn't complete its work. I understand the concern that the SEC is behind on several rulemakings, many of which date back 5 years to when Dodd-Frank was passed, but still think that 4 months to issue rules is way too short and may result in mistakes being made along the way. While I agree that this is a creative approach to force action by the regulator, we should also be supporting increased funding for the SEC as we layer on additional rulemakings. Nevertheless, I'm offering this amendment to address many of the concerns of the regulators. Specifically, the new language of the bill provides much-needed clarity on its impact on other provisions in the securities laws, such as the anti-manipulation and anti-fraud provisions that would continue to apply to ETF research reports. And again, it makes clear that FINRA will have appropriate oversight over those research reports and that its standards regulating the content of those reports provide sufficient investor protections. I'm not 100% happy with the final product, but that is often the case when one works toward a compromise. If these changes are adopted, I will support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes himself. At this point, I would urge rejection of the ranking member's amendment. There may be some worthy provisions, but I think it bears saying again with respect to process, the less time that the majority has to review an amendment, the longer the amendment, the more complex the amendment, the lower probability it will be accepted in the midst of markup. There is some complex material here that could change the underlying bill in ways perhaps intended and unintended. I would certainly urge that the gentleman from Arkansas and the gentleman from Delaware have, at their leisure, review this amendment, and I would be very happy to enter into a recommendation with them before this comes to the floor, should it be worthy to make a recommendation to the Rules Committee to find the ranking member's amendment to make it in order. But I think we received this, and again, members can give no notice to the majority. That is their will, that is their privilege, but I think we received this during the last series of votes. Members on our side of the aisle, staff on our side of the aisle, have not had an opportunity to analyze the 8 pages of material here, and so I would urge at this time a rejection of this amendment. There are some certain terms of art here that I don't completely understand. Should it prove worthy, again, it can always be made in order on the floor. Does the gentleman from Arkansas seek time? I'll yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Arkansas.
I want to thank the ranking member, thank Mrs. Maloney for their comments about the bill, appreciate their staff efforts in working on it. Thank again Mr. Carney as well. Just in a couple of reactions for members present. First, I don't think this research is necessarily trying to seek more retail investors to the product category, because there's already $1.8 trillion of these used by the retail investment community currently. Instead, it's to give them more information as this product becomes more and more connected to retail accounts of all sizes and even small institutional accounts. Secondly, I do believe that FINRA's rules on 2711 and the anti-fraud applications apply even in my original draft of the bill. And on the subject of index funds or ETFs, exchange-traded funds that follow commodity or derivative types, let's be sure we're clear on the subject matter, and that is these are exchange-traded funds that already exist, that have already been underwritten, they have a market cap minimum, they already exist, and this would be research covering those existing investments that are out in the marketplace that already have market acceptance. It is not investing per se in a commodity or per se in a derivative, but in fact an exchange-traded fund that follows, for example, an oil index or a agricultural commodity index. And finally, on short time period, Mr. Chairman, again, we've established, I think, conclusively that this has been a long time coming, some 17 years, where the Commission has received encouragement to do it and just has not done it, and we are not breaking new ground. And so I don't think the time frames, therefore, are unreasonable given the long history with the Division of Investment Management in this arena. And again, I thank you and the ranking member for consideration, but I do urge my colleagues to reject the amendment. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back to the chair, and I just want to thank the gentleman from Arkansas, the gentleman from Delaware for their work here, long overdue, important work. The chair yields back the balance of his time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? The gentleman from Delaware seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, first I want to thank you for your offer to allow us time to work on an amendment. Mr. Hill and I have already spoken about that. He identified some of his responses to the specifics in the bill. Mr. Hill is an expert in this area, and he brings that expertise to this effort. I am not an expert in this area. I have expressed an interest, though, in sitting down with all concerned parties to understand the specifics here. The devil is always in the details, and I at least want to understand what we're doing and try to make some assessment as to what adjustments that we can make so that all parties can be concerned. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for for that offer and let you know that I am more than willing to do it myself and with my staff. And I know Mr. Hill is willing to do that as well. And I want to thank the ranking member again and her staff for going through this in great detail, and look forward to working with them and the concerns that they have for a better final product.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I would like to thank the chairman for encouraging all parties to work together to resolve what I think are minor differences almost. I would like to say to the chairman that the lateness of the submission for the amendment was due to the fact that both sides worked very hard late into the night to try and resolve differences, and that happens sometimes. And while I would like to see the exercise of flexibility when something like this happens, when you have people who are really working together to resolve differences, to let them know that we do respect that they have put that kind of time in. But given, you have ruled, and both sides of the aisle have indicated their commitment to working on this bill prior to it going to the floor. I would just like to say that I look forward to working out whatever differences we may have so that the bill may proceed. And with that, I yield back the time to you, Mr. Carney.
Thank you, Madam Ranking Member, and I just want to reiterate that I have every confidence that Mr. Hill will work with us. He has throughout this whole process, and I appreciate that very much. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I will ask the gentleman to yield again. May I do that?
Yes, you may.
I would yield. I will yield.
Okay. I was, about to encourage and call for, a recorded vote on this bill, but I'm not going to do that because at least I can give you something on your birthday. Happy birthday to you, Mr. Carney.
That is one hell of a birthday present. I will wholeheartedly accept and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Apparently it's a good birthday for everyone on the committee. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentle lady from California. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption and reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. 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 All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. For what purposes, gentlemen from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2357. The clerk will report the bill which has been distributed in advance.
H.R. 2357, to direct the Securities and Exchange Commission to revise Form
Without objection, the
S3.
bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and having saved the very best for last, I am proud to submit my legislation, H.R. 2357, the Accelerating Access to Capital Act, which builds upon other efforts by this committee in providing simplified disclosure requirements and reducing onerous burdens for smaller companies in order to lower the cost of raising capital. Specifically, this legislation would extend to smaller reporting companies the ability to utilize Form S3, a much more simplified registration for companies that have already met prior reporting requirements with the SEC. Form S3 would provide significant benefits both in its short form as well as by allowing forward incorporation by reference and the ability to offer securities off the shelf. Additionally, streamlining this disclosure regime will lower compliance costs associated with filing redundant paperwork, which will in turn allow companies to direct more resources to growing their business. For small businesses that serve as the primary engine for the employment in this country, easing filing requirements and onerous disclosure by expanding the use of Form S-3 will ultimately lead to further job creation. By example, I'd like to discuss one such small business that this legislation would specifically benefit, Fuel Performance Solutions, which is based out of my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. They have spent the last 10 years working on exciting fuel products that could potentially save Americans money at the pump and reduce harmful emissions. This is an example of the exciting work that routinely is being taken up by small companies and motivated entrepreneurs around the country that need access to capital the most. In order to fund this research in breakthrough technology, Fuel Performance Solutions eventually decided to register with the SEC and go public in order to raise more capital and expand their business. As a result, they took on SEC reporting obligations and provided 2 years of audited financial statements. Yet, still, they were unable to utilize the S-3 conduct a short-form registration for further public funding, as they were a company with a public float under $75 million. Ultimately, Fuel Performance Solutions calculated the savings they could have realized by filing under Form S-3. For just a $5 million capital raise, they would have saved approximately $225,000 in legal, accounting, and investment banking fees. Additionally, under Form S-3, they could have received SEC approval in days rather than months, and thereby obtained certainty in regard to the funding of their business. Extending these cost-saving provisions to smaller companies that large companies are currently able to enjoy is absolutely critical and can make the difference in their ability to issue an additional offering, expand their business, and create more jobs. The SEC previously extended Form S-3 to some smaller reporting companies in 2007 and stated that they would review its effectiveness in the future. Meanwhile, it has been over 7 years with no signs of investor harm, and yet the SEC has failed to revisit the issue. This is despite the fact that this provision has been recommended by the SEC's Government Business Forum on Small Business Capital Formation. On behalf of small companies across the country, like Fuel Performance Solutions, we cannot wait on the SEC to take this up on their own time. It is time for Congress to step in, Mr. Chairman, and I urge passage of this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
As I mentioned earlier about H.R. 1723, last Congress, a bill was considered that included few common sense provisions, but unfortunately tied them to other provisions that were anything but wise. Those provisions have been split into H.R. 1723, which I supported earlier today, and this bill, which I oppose. H.R. 2357 allows microcap companies traded on an exchange to issue an unlimited number of shares within a year, and allows unlisted microcaps, including those trading on the pink sheets, to issue up to 1/3 of their existing share volume within a year. Last year's securities law professor, John Coffey, explained that such a change invites potential disaster and investor confusion. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to forget that capital formation primarily involves two private sector actors, the company raising the capital and the investor providing the capital. Reducing costs for the issuer by removing additional disclosures to both existing investors and potential investors only serves to increase the required rate of return investors demand of the company. As a result, such proposals can't see the forest for the trees. This proposal allows companies that are traded over the counter or only on the pink sheets to make use of a limited shelf registration with no prior notice. Professor Bullard testified that the bill was inconsistent with promoting efficient markets in capital formation or protecting investors. He explained that while the bill enables microcap companies to take advantage of favorable conditions by quickly issuing shares, speedy access also leads to accounting fraud, market manipulation, insider trading, and sales of artificially inflated stock. Mr. Bullard noted that previous studies had found that 80% of manipulation cases involved non-exchange traded stocks. and a positive correlation between lower disclosure requirements and the likelihood of manipulation. Previously, the Consumer Federation of America wrote a letter stating that most likely, and perhaps the best outcome, if this legislation is adopted, is that the market simply will not accept such offerings, and thus it will do nothing to promote capital formation. The CFA goes on to say that this bill increases the risk of fraud and misconduct without offering any benefits to justify that added risk. Mr. Chairman, we should be spending time on legislation to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, which supports 1,150 exporters in my home state of California. For that reason, and because this legislation would harm investors and increase the risk of fraud, I urge a no vote. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to support Representative Wagner's legislation, H.R. 2357, the Accelerating Access to Capital Act of 2015. This good bill would allow smaller reporting companies to utilize Form S-3, a more simplified registration statement, when issuing securities. Form S-3 is mostly used by larger companies with a public float greater than 75 million. By allowing smaller issuers that fall under that public float to use the more simplified S-3 form, this bill would lower compliance costs and provide additional capital for companies who want to expand. Form S-3 allows for forward incorporation by reference and allows those securities to be sold off the shelf, which is essential for smaller companies who have a tougher time accessing the capital markets. Ms. Wagner's bill would also allow companies whose securities are traded over the counter to use Form S-3 so long as their offering is below 1/3 of their public float. Smaller reporting companies should be able to take advantage of the same filing efficiencies and streamlined disclosures that larger companies already enjoy. By allowing these smaller issuers to utilize Form S-3, these companies will have additional capital that they can better employ. By helping these small companies, we will be helping the very companies that must succeed if we want to see job growth today and future prosperity for our children and our grandchildren. I urge the passage of this important bill, and I thank Ms. Wagner for her leadership. I also thank the Chairman for including this bill in this markup today, and I yield back the balance of my time. And I'd be happy to yield to the gentlelady.
In addressing the ranking member's concerns, I would duly note that the SEC in 2007 originally proposed extending Form S-3 eligibility to companies not traded on a national securities exchange, but later added the exchange requirement as a last-minute safety valve. This would include companies quoted on the over-the-counter bulletin board and pink sheets. It is important to note that these companies must still be registered under the Exchange Act and file periodic reports with the appropriate regulatory agency. Also, in order to be eligible for Form S-3, a company must have timely filed 12 months of reports beforehand. Once again, it has been over 7 years, and the SEC still has not reviewed this provision, nor has it shown investor harm, despite the SEC's working group on small business capital formation recommending it. I yield back and thank the gentleman for yielding his time.
Would the gentleman yield to the Chair?
I yield to the Chair.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. As the markup winds down, one, I want to thank the gentlelady from Missouri for her leadership here, but I want to thank all the members, particularly almost every bill was worked on a bipartisan basis. I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Garrett from New Jersey, for shepherding this through the Capital Markets Subcommittee. It is very difficult to have the benefits of capitalism without capital, and we know that capital formation access, particularly for our early growth companies, our smaller companies, is very challenged in this environment. Again, most of these are rather modest bipartisan proposals, but still are important and can help jumpstart jobs and help get us away from this anemic condition where we're at the generational low in entrepreneurial activity. So again, I just want to thank members on both sides of the aisle who work together. I want to thank Chairman Garrett for his work as well on this, and I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I yield back to him, and I assume he yields back his time. He yields back his time. Are there any?
Enter into the record.
Yes. For what purposes, gentlelady, the ranking member seek recognition?
To request unanimous consent to enter into the record a number of communications from Public Citizen, M&A Securities Group, SIFMA, Americans for Financial Reform, and SBIA.
Without objection. Are there any amendments, any further discussion? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption and reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes appear to have it, and the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. As permitted by the resolution to adopt rules of the Committee on Financial Services pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the House of Representatives, which was adopted on January 14, 2015, I offer a resolution to name a new Republican member to the task force to investigate terrorism financing and for other purposes. The clerk will report the resolution as it's being distributed.
Resolution to name a Republican member of the committee to the task force to investigate terrorism financing and for other purposes. Resolved that Mr. Williams is named to the task force to investigate terrorism financing.
The Chair recognizes himself. I inadvertently left this out earlier this morning. On the majority side, we had a vacancy on the terrorism financing task force. Mr. Williams is being appointed to that, so I move the resolution's adoption. Without objection, the resolution is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee will recess until promptly at 5:30. I wish to alert all members that the floor has now moved up proceedings of expected time for floor votes, so it's important that all members return promptly at 5:30. We'll get through as much of this as we can. We'll resume proceedings on pending recorded votes at that time. The committee stands in recess.